The Nevada sun blazed overhead, like the devil's own forge, turning the air into shimmering waves that danced across the endless expanse of cracked earth and scattered sage. Caleb Branson pulled his chestnut mare to a halt, the leather reins slick with sweat in his weathered hands as he squinted through the heat haze at what lay ahead. A woman knelt in the dust 50 yards away, her body curved protectively around a small, motionless form. Her dark hair hung in matted strings around a face burned raw by days of merciless exposure, lips cracked and bleeding from thirst. The child in her arms, a boy of perhaps 7 years, lay still as death, his mouth slightly parted, flies gathering at the corners of his eyes. Behind them sat the skeletal remains of a covered wagon, its left wheel shattered and half buried in the hardpan canvas cover, shredded by wind and time. Something in the tableau struck Caleb as wrong, beyond the obvious tragedy of abandonment and exposure. The woman's position, the way she clutched the boy, the desperate intensity in her sunken eyes as they found his, it all spoke of more than simple misfortune. When she spoke, her voice was barely a rasp, dry, as wind through dead leaves, but the words cut through the desert silence like a blade. They tried to kill us. Caleb's hand moved instinctively to the Colt .45 at his hip. In 5 years of riding alone through the territories, he'd learned to trust his instincts about people and situations. This woman wasn't raving from sun madness. She was telling the truth. "Ma'am," he said, dismounting slowly to avoid startling her. "Name's Caleb Branson. Looks like you folks could use some help." The woman, she couldn't be more than 25. Though the desert had aged her, cruelly studied his face with the wariness of prey that had learned to fear every shadow. "I'm Lily Prescott," she whispered. "This is my son, Thomas. We've been out here so long." Caleb approached carefully, noting the way her grip on the boy tightened at his movement. "How long since you've had water?" 2 days, maybe 3. Time gets strange when you're watching your child fade away. Her voice cracked on the last words, tears she couldn't spare threatening to fall. Kneeling beside them, Caleb placed the back of his hand against the boy's forehead. Thomas's skin burned with fever, but his breathing was steady, if shallow. The child stirred slightly at the touch, his eyelids fluttering. "He's not dying today," Caleb said with more conviction than he felt. He retrieved his water skin from his saddle, tilting it carefully to the boy's cracked lips. "Easy now, son." As Thomas took small, desperate sips, Lily reached for the offered water with shaking hands. "We were part of a wagon train," she said between careful swallows. 27 families heading to Oregon. Started from Missouri 3 months back, full of hope and dreams. Her laugh was bitter as alkali dust. "Dreams don't last long out here." Caleb studied the broken wagon while she drank. The damage to the wheel wasn't from rough travel or bad luck. Someone had deliberately weakened the metal hub with tools scoring it deep enough that it would fail under stress, but not immediately. The wooden spokes showed saw marks where they'd been cut partway through before snapping. "Mrs. Prescott," he said carefully, "tell me about the folks who left you behind." Her face went pale beneath the sunburn. "How did you know we were left?" "Because that wheel was sabotaged. Someone wanted you stranded out here." He gestured to the scored metal. This was done deliberate-like. Lily's composure cracked, and the story came pouring out. Her husband, William, had borrowed money from several families in the wagon train to outfit their journey. When pneumonia took him 2 weeks into the trip, those debts had fallen to her. But worse than the money was the train's leader, a man named Greavy, who'd made it clear that a widow with a sick child had other ways to settle accounts. When I refused his advances, she said, shame coloring her voice, he got mean. Said I was putting on airs that beggars couldn't afford to be choosy. That night, he came to my wagon drunk and angry. What stopped him? Thomas woke up screaming from the fever. The commotion brought folks running and Greavy backed off. but I saw the look in his eyes. He wasn't finished with me. She pulled Thomas closer, the boy's head lolling against her shoulder. Next morning, he declared we were too sick to travel. Said it was for the good of the group. Caleb's jaw tightened. And then they made sure you'd never catch up. Samuel said he'd send help from the next settlement, but I knew he was lying. He wanted us dead and buried with no one left to ask uncomfortable questions about William's debts or what he tried to do to me. A dust cloud on the eastern horizon caught Caleb's attention, 3 riders moving fast and purposeful. Even at distance, their posture in the saddle spoke of men on a hunt. "How long since your wagon train moved on?" he asked. 3 days. "Those riders coming our way, they're not from your train, are they?" Terror flooded Lily's eyes as she spotted the approaching horsemen. "No. Oh, dear God, no. Samuel must have sent them back to make sure we were properly dead." Without hesitation, Caleb scooped Thomas into his arms, the boy's fever-light weight shocking him. "We're going to ground. Bring what you can carry." The narrow arroyo he'd spotted earlier cut through the Badlands like a knife wound barely wide enough for 3 people, but deep enough to hide them from casual observation. Caleb positioned himself where he could watch the wagon, while keeping Lily and Thomas behind him, his Winchester ready. "Not a sound," he whispered as the riders drew near. "One peep from the boy could get us all killed." Thomas stirred in his mother's arms, his fever making him mumble incoherently. Caleb placed a gentle but firm hand over the child's mouth, meeting Lily's terrified eyes with a look that conveyed everything: absolute silence or death. The 3 men reached the wagon as afternoon shadows began to lengthen. From their hiding place, Caleb could hear their voices carry on the still air. "That wheel's been fixed." One called out, his voice rough with disappointment. "Fresh horse tracks, too. Someone's been helping them." "Greavy ain't gonna like this news," another replied. "He paid us good money to confirm they were buzzard bait. Then we'd better make sure they end up that way real quick-like. Fan out and search. They can't have gone far with a sick kid slowing them down." For 2 hours, Caleb held his breath as the hired killers combed the area around the wagon. They fired shots into likely hiding spots, their bullets ricocheting off rocks uncomfortably close to the arroyo. Thomas's fever made him wheeze and mutter, and twice Caleb had to gently cover the boy's mouth when his labored breathing threatened to give them away. Probably coyote food by now anyway. One of the searchers finally said, as full darkness settled over the desert, "This heat would cook a man's brain in his skull. Greavy just wants to be sure. You know how he gets about loose ends." As the killers finally gave up and rode away, Caleb remained motionless until their hoofbeats faded completely. Only then did he allow himself to breathe normally, the weight of what he'd heard settling over him like a shroud. These weren't random bandits or opportunistic raiders. They were professionals hired to eliminate witnesses and clean up Greavy's mistakes. Which meant Lily's story wasn't just true, it was worse than she'd realized. "We wait until well past midnight," he whispered. "Then we move fast and quiet toward Butcher's Bend. It's the nearest settlement 3 days east if we push hard. What if those men are watching the trail? Then we'd better hope I remember enough of my scouting tricks to keep us alive." As they huddled in the narrow arroyo, listening to the desert wind moan through the rocks above, Caleb found himself thinking about the choice he'd made. 5 years ago, after the fire at Cold Creek took his wife Sarah and daughter Emma, he'd sworn off getting involved in other people's troubles. The pain of loss had nearly destroyed him, and only constant movement, staying ahead of memories and obligations, had kept him sane. Now here he was risking his life for strangers, and the irony wasn't lost on him. Sarah would have called it fate. Emma would have clapped her hands and called it an adventure. Both of them would have been right. They emerged from hiding near dawn. Thomas's fever finally showing signs of breaking. The boy was able to walk short distances with help, though he remained weak and disoriented. As they resumed their eastward journey, the repaired wagon creaking along the rutted trail. Lily began to reveal more about her desperate situation. "There's something else I haven't told you," she said as they walked beside the slowly moving wagon. William didn't just owe money to the other families. He owned something valuable: mining claims up in the Sierra Nevada. Silver deposits his father had staked out years before the big strikes. Caleb kept his eyes on the trail ahead, but his mind was racing. And this greavy character knows about these claims. William showed them to him back in Missouri, trying to use them as collateral for the wagon train passage. Samuel said they weren't worth the paper they were printed on, but I could see the hunger in his eyes when he looked at those documents. "Where are the deeds now?" Lily patted a small oilskin pouch tied around her waist beneath her dress. "William made me promise never to let them out of my sight. Said they were Thomas's inheritance, the only thing of value he could leave his son." The full scope of Greavy's plan was becoming clear now. With William dead and his family eliminated, there would be no one left to challenge a forged claim that the mining rights had been signed over as debt payment. It was a plan worthy of a snake, and apparently Greavy was just the man to execute it. They made good time through the morning heat, but as the sun reached its merciless zenith, Thomas began to falter. The boy's fever was rising again, and his small face had taken on the waxy pallor that spoke of serious illness. "He needs proper doctoring." Lily said, her voice tight with worry. "And soon." Caleb studied the harsh country ahead, then made a decision that would haunt him. "There's a shortcut through Ghost Canyon. It's dangerous, lots of loose rock and flash flood potential, but it'll save us a full day's travel." "How dangerous?" Dangerous enough that most folks go the long way around. But I've been through it twice, and if we're careful." He looked at Thomas's flushed face. "Question is whether we can afford not to try." Lily didn't hesitate. "We'll take the shortcut." Ghost Canyon earned its name from the way wind howled through its narrow passages, creating sounds like voices from beyond the grave. The path was barely wide enough for their wagon, with towering walls of red sandstone rising hundreds of feet on either side. Loose rocks constantly rattled down from above, and the horses shied nervously at every echo. They were halfway through the treacherous passage when disaster struck. The stress of rough terrain finally overwhelmed Caleb's temporary repair job, and the wagon wheel collapsed completely, nearly throwing Thomas from his seat, before grinding to a halt against the canyon wall. "End of the line for the wagon," Caleb said grimly after examining the utterly destroyed wheel. "We're walking from here." He distributed their remaining supplies into manageable packs, then lifted Thomas onto his shoulders. The boy was lighter than he should be. Fever and poor food had taken their toll. But he managed a weak smile when Caleb asked how he was holding up. "I'm okay, Mr. Caleb." Thomas whispered, his small arms tight around the man's neck. "Will we be safe soon?" "Count on it, son. Just hold tight." They made camp that night in a sheltered alcove, the canyon walls blocking the stars but providing blessed protection from the constant wind. As Thomas slept fitfully against his mother's side, Lily spoke in tones barely above a whisper. "Caleb, there's something I need to tell you. Something I've been afraid to say because it makes everything so much worse." The gravity in her voice made him set down his coffee and give her his full attention. "I'm listening. Samuel Greavy isn't just the wagon train leader." Her words came out in a rush, as if speaking them quickly would lessen their impact. "He's William's brother. My brother-in-law." The revelation hit Caleb like a physical blow. In 5 years of scouting the territories, he'd seen plenty of greed and violence. But family betrayal on this scale was something else entirely. William never talked much about his relatives. Lily continued, tears starting to flow. Said they'd had a falling out years ago over those mining claims. But when we joined the wagon train in Missouri, there was Samuel all smiles and family reunion. Said he'd forgiven the past, wanted to help us start fresh in Oregon. "A man's own brother," Caleb muttered, shaking his head. "It gets worse." Lily's voice dropped to barely audible. I don't think William died of pneumonia. I think Samuel poisoned him. The accusation hung in the desert air like smoke from a funeral pyre. That's a serious charge, ma'am. You have proof? William was getting better. The fever had broken 3 days before he died, and he was talking about getting back on his feet, maybe even taking a turn driving the wagon. Then Samuel brought him some special medicine, said it would speed his recovery. Her voice cracked with grief and rage. William drank it down, grateful-like, and within an hour he was convulsing and vomiting blood. Caleb felt ice water run through his veins, despite the desert heat. Anyone else see this happen? Thomas did. My poor boy watched his father die in agony, and he's been having nightmares about it ever since. He's too young to understand what he witnessed. But if he ever remembers clearly enough to tell someone, Greavy would kill him to keep him quiet, Caleb finished. And you too, because you'd believe your son's story. That's why I couldn't stay with the wagon train, even if Samuel had allowed it. I was living with my husband's murderer, sharing meals with him, letting him play the grieving brother while he planned our deaths. Lily gathered Thomas closer as the boy stirred in his sleep. But I had no proof, no way to make anyone believe me. And Samuel was so careful to play his part, the helpful brother-in-law looking after his poor widowed sister. In the flickering firelight, Thomas began to mumble in his sleep, his voice high and frightened. Uncle Samuel. No, Papa, don't drink that. It smells bad. Papa, wake up. Lily stroked her son's hair with shaking fingers. He remembers more than I realized. God help us, Caleb. If Samuel reaches Butcher's Bend before we do and establishes his version of events, he won't, Caleb said with fierce determination. We're going to get there first, expose him for the murdering snake he is, and make sure you and Thomas are safe. But even as he spoke the words, Caleb wondered if he was making a promise he couldn't keep. They still had a day's hard travel ahead, and Greavy had a significant head start. Worse, the man had money and apparent legitimacy on his side, while they had only the word of a supposedly grief-mad widow and her traumatized child. As dawn broke over the canyon walls, painting the red stone gold and orange, they prepared to resume their desperate journey. Thomas was stronger after a night's rest, his fever lower, though not completely gone. He walked between them as they picked their way through the remaining canyon passage, his small hand alternating between Caleb's calloused grip and his mother's softer one. Mr. Caleb, the boy said as they emerged into harsh sunlight at the canyon's far end. My papa used to tell me stories about brave men who fought bad guys. Are you one of those men? The innocent question pierced Caleb's heart like an arrow. I don't know about brave, son. I'm just a man trying to do what's right. That's what the brave men always said in Papa's stories. From the ridge above Butcher's Bend, they could see the dust cloud of a single rider who had arrived just ahead of them. Even at distance, Caleb recognized the distinctive paint stallion that Lily identified as belonging to Samuel Greavy. He's already there, she whispered, shading her eyes against the afternoon glare. Look, he's coming out of the land office with papers in his hand. They watched in growing despair as Greavy emerged from the building, clearly satisfied with whatever business he'd conducted inside. The man's confident posture and obvious pleasure suggested he'd successfully filed the stolen mining claims in his own name. What do we do now? Lily asked. We tell the truth and hope it's enough. But as they made their way down the slope toward town, Thomas walking unsteadily between them, a group of armed men approached from the main street. At their head strode the sheriff, a heavy-set man with cold eyes and a badge that caught the sunlight like a warning. That's far enough, the lawman called when they were still 50 yards from the first buildings. Caleb Branson, you're under arrest for kidnapping and endangering the welfare of a child. Caleb's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but the sheriff already had his weapon drawn, flanked by 2 deputies with rifles ready. Sheriff, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Caleb began, but the man cut him off with a sharp gesture. "No misunderstanding here, mister. Mr. Greavy told us all about how you abducted this poor widow and her sick boy. Says the woman's been driven half-mad by grief and sun exposure, making up wild tales about murder and conspiracy. Says you took advantage of her addled condition to fill her head with nonsense." Lily stepped forward desperately, Thomas clinging to her skirt with both hands. "Sheriff, that's not true. This man saved our lives. Samuel Greavy is the one who tried to kill us. He murdered my husband and—" "Ma'am, you're clearly not in your right mind." The sheriff interrupted, his tone patronizing and dismissive. "Mr. Greavy explained how you've been having spells since your husband's death, seeing things that aren't there, making wild accusations against folks trying to help you. We're going to get you and the boys some proper care while we sort this mess out." As handcuffs clicked around Caleb's wrists with the finality of a coffin lid closing, he met Lily's terrified eyes and saw his own helplessness reflected there. Greavy had played his hand with the skill of a professional gambler, arriving first to establish his version of events, and clearly buying the sheriff's cooperation with either money or promises of future profit. "Mrs. Prescott and the boy will be kept safe in protective custody," the sheriff announced as his deputies began marching Caleb toward the jail. "And you, Branson, will have plenty of time to contemplate the consequences of taking advantage of folks in distress." As the jail door slammed shut behind him with an echoing clang, Caleb could hear Thomas crying for his mother, and Lily's voice growing fainter as they were led away to whatever protective custody meant in a town where justice was clearly for sale. Alone in his cell, Caleb stared through the barred window at the westering sun and realized that everything he'd feared about getting involved in other people's troubles had come to pass. But somewhere in the growing darkness, a woman and child were depending on him to find a way out of this carefully constructed trap. And Samuel Greavy still had murder to answer for. The livery stable where they'd imprisoned Lily and Thomas sat at the far end of Butcher's Bend's main street, a ramshackle wooden structure that served double duty housing the town's horses and storing whatever the sheriff didn't want, cluttering his jail. Through his cell window, Caleb could see the building clearly in the moonlight, noting the single guard posted outside and the way the dry timber construction would burn like tinder if someone applied flame to it. That thought had barely formed in his mind when he spotted a shadowy figure moving through the alley behind the stable. Even at distance, he recognized Samuel Greavy's distinctive silhouette and the purposeful way the man moved through the darkness, carrying something that glinted in the pale light. Horror washed over Caleb as he realized what was about to happen. With Thomas recovering from his fever and potentially able to remember and testify about his father's murder, Greavy couldn't risk letting the boy live to tell his story. And what better way to eliminate the inconvenient witnesses than a tragic fire that would look like a terrible accident? Caleb's fingers found the small piece of metal he'd kept hidden in his boot sole for years, a lockpick he'd fashioned during his scouting days, when getting out of tight situations often meant getting through locked doors quickly and quietly. He'd never expected to need the skill again. But the frontier had a way of bringing the past back when you least wanted it. Working by feel in the darkness, he manipulated the simple mechanism of his cell lock. The sheriff clearly hadn't expected much trouble from a man facing kidnapping charges. Frontier jails were built more for Saturday night drunks than desperate men with specialized skills. The lock yielded with a soft click just as orange light began to flicker in the stable's windows. Caleb slipped from his cell like a ghost, pausing only to retrieve his gun belt from the sheriff's desk before making his way to the jail's back door. The lawman and his deputies were likely asleep or drinking, confident that their prisoner was secure and their version of events would hold until morning. Outside, the smell of smoke was already thick in the night air. Flames were beginning to lick at the stable's weathered walls, and through the building's single window, Caleb could see the terrified faces of Lily and Thomas as they pressed against the glass, trapped by doors that had been barred from the outside. Racing to the nearby horse trough, Caleb soaked his shirt and bandana in the precious water, then wrapped the dripping cloth around his face for protection against the smoke. The stable's east wall showed signs of age and weather damage. If he could find the right spot, he might be able to break through before the fire spread too far. The sound of splintering wood mixed with the growing roar of flames as Caleb threw his full weight against a section of weathered boards. Once, twice, 3 times, he struck the wall with his shoulder before the planks gave way, creating an opening just barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. Inside the stable, smoke filled the air, like a living creature reducing visibility to mere feet and making every breath a struggle. The heat was already intense, and falling embers singed his exposed skin as he fought his way toward the ladder leading to the loft where Lily and Thomas were trapped. "Caleb!" Lily's voice cut through the crackling roar of flames. "Up here, hurry, the floor's starting to give way." The wooden ladder was already beginning to char its rungs, hot enough to raise blisters on his palms. Above him, he could see Lily at the edge of the loft, holding Thomas in her arms, as black smoke billowed around them, like the breath of hell itself. "And the whole loft's gonna collapse." She called down, her voice hoarse from inhaling smoke. "I don't think we can make it to the ladder." "Then you're gonna have to drop him." Caleb positioned himself beneath the loft, arms outstretched despite the pain in his burned hands. "Send Thomas down first." For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Lily hesitated. The maternal instinct to hold on to her child warred with the desperate knowledge that letting go was his only chance of survival. Then, with a mother's terrible courage, she lowered Thomas over the edge of the loft and released him. Caleb caught the boy against his chest, feeling Thomas's arms wrap around his neck in a grip born of absolute terror. The child was fully conscious now, his fever finally broken, but his eyes were wide with the kind of fear that could mark a person for life. But even as she prepared to jump, a massive support beam crashed down from the burning roof, sending up a shower of sparks and flame that singed the hair on Caleb's head. The impact shook the entire structure, and he could hear the building's framework groaning under the mounting stress. Lily jumped just as the loft floor began to collapse beneath her feet. Caleb lunged forward, still holding Thomas, and managed to cushion Lily's fall with his body. The 3 of them hit the burning ground hard, rolling away from the cascading debris as sections of roof timber crashed down around them like meteors. Through the smoke and flame, the sharp crack of a gunshot rang out. Then another. Samuel Greavy stood silhouetted in the hole. Caleb had smashed through the wall, his revolver trained on the 3 survivors. The firelight revealed his face clearly for the first time, and Caleb was shocked by what he saw there. Not just rage and desperation, but something approaching madness. The careful mask of the grieving brother-in-law had finally slipped away, revealing the true monster beneath. "You should have minded your own damn business, Branson." Greavy snarled, his voice barely audible over the roar of flames. "Should have kept riding like the coward you are and let the desert solve my problems. Well, like you solved your brother's life." Caleb pushed Lily and Thomas behind him, shielding them with his body while scanning desperately for his fallen gun belt. William was weak. Greavy's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Always was weak ever since we were boys. Couldn't see the potential in those mining claims, couldn't understand what they represented. I offered to buy them from him fair and square, but he got all sentimental about keeping them for his precious son. So you poisoned him." "I did what needed doing. Those claims are worth more than this whole godforsaken territory, and I wasn't about to let some sniveling brat and his sanctimonious mother stand between me and the future I deserved." Around them, the fire continued its relentless advance, consuming everything in its path. The air grew hotter with each passing second, and Caleb could feel his clothes beginning to smolder from the radiant heat. But Greavy seemed oblivious to the danger, focused entirely on eliminating the last witnesses to his crimes. "You're gonna burn up with us," Caleb said, edging slowly toward where he'd glimpsed his gun belt in the debris. "This whole place is coming down around our ears." Maybe so. but at least I'll have the satisfaction of knowing my secrets die with you. And when they find the bodies, it'll just be a tragic accident, poor widow and her boy, overcome by smoke, trying to escape a fire. You'll be the villain who got them killed with your reckless rescue attempt." That was when Thomas spoke up, his young voice clear and strong despite the smoke. "I remember what you did to my papa." Greavy's confident expression faltered. "What did you say, boy?" "I remember the medicine you gave him, the way it smelled funny like bitter almonds. I remember how Papa screamed and got sick and died." Thomas stepped partially out from behind Caleb, his small frame trembling but his voice steady. "And I'm gonna tell everyone what you did to him." For a moment, the killer stood frozen, the weight of the child's words hitting him like a physical blow. In that instant of doubt and horror, Caleb spotted his gun belt lying half-buried under a pile of burning debris. He dove for it desperately, his fingers closing around the familiar grip of his Colt just as Greavy raised his weapon again. The two shots came almost simultaneously, Greavy's wild and panicked, Caleb's aimed with the precision of a man who'd spent years surviving by his skill with firearms. The would-be murderer stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder as dark blood seeped between his fingers, but he didn't go down. Instead, he raised his gun for another shot, madness blazing in his eyes. "If I'm dying, you're all dying with me." Caleb's second shot took Greavy's center mass, spinning him around and sending him crashing through the weakened wall into the alley beyond. The man hit the ground hard and lay still, his schemes and murders finally ended. "Move." Caleb grabbed Lily and Thomas, pulling them toward the jagged opening as the stable's remaining supports finally surrendered to the flames. They tumbled out into the cool night air just as the entire structure collapsed behind them in a roar of fire and falling timber that could be heard throughout the sleeping town. The commotion had awakened half of Butcher's Bend, and soon the street was filled with bucket brigades and concerned citizens working to contain the blaze. When the sheriff arrived to find his prisoner free and Samuel Greavy dead in the alley, the full story came pouring out in a torrent of accusations and revelations. Initially, the lawman tried to maintain his original narrative about Caleb being a kidnapper and Lily suffering from grief-induced madness. But Thomas's clear, detailed account of witnessing his father's murder, delivered with the matter-of-fact honesty that only children possess, began to erode the sheriff's confidence in his paid-for version of events. When Lily produced the genuine land deeds from her hidden pouch, their dates and legal descriptions proved beyond doubt that William had owned the mining claims long before any supposed debts to his brother. Even more damning, a search of Greavy's belongings revealed forged documents claiming ownership of the same properties clearly prepared well in advance of his victims' planned deaths. The final blow to the sheriff's position came when several townspeople stepped forward with their own observations about Greavy's behavior. The man had been asking suspicious questions around town about inheritance laws and abandoned property claims. He'd also been seen near the livery stable shortly before the fire started, carrying a can that reeked of kerosene. Faced with overwhelming evidence and a crowd of angry citizens who'd witnessed Caleb's heroic rescue firsthand, the sheriff had no choice but to officially clear all charges and acknowledge the truth of the situation. On a "let it be recorded," he announced to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying the reluctant authority of a man who'd been outmaneuvered, that Caleb Branson acted with honor and courage in protecting Mrs. Prescott and her son from a murderous conspiracy. Samuel Greavy stands exposed as a killer and thief who got exactly what he deserved. The crowd's murmur of approval was music to Caleb's ears, but he found himself focused on Thomas, who had fallen asleep in his mother's arms despite all the excitement surrounding them. The boy's fever was completely gone now, his breathing deep and peaceful. For the first time since that blazing afternoon in the desert, Thomas looked like what he truly was, a normal child who'd endured far too much but would survive to see better days. "I don't know how to thank you," Lily said quietly, her voice rough from smoke inhalation, but filled with profound gratitude. I know you didn't want to get involved in our troubles, but you saved our lives. Both of us. Caleb nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of exhaustion settling over him like a heavy blanket. The burns on his hands and arms throbbed painfully, and the smoke he'd inhaled made every breath feel like swallowing sand. But they were alive, and they were safe, and Samuel Greavy would never hurt anyone again. "What will you do now?" he asked. "Still planning on Oregon?" "I think so. Those mining claims might prove valuable eventually, but they're tied up in legal complications that could take months or years to resolve. Thomas and I need a fresh start somewhere we can put all this behind us and build new lives." She paused, studying his face in the flickering light of the dying fire. "What about you, Caleb? Where will you go from here?" It was a question he'd been avoiding even in his own thoughts. A week ago, his life had been simple: keep moving, avoid attachments, carry his grief like a familiar burden that at least provided the comfort of routine. Now, looking at the woman and child he'd risked everything to protect, he felt something stirring in his chest that he thought had died forever in the ashes of Cold Creek. "I reckon I'll see you folks safely to Oregon." He heard himself saying the words coming from some deep place he thought was sealed off forever. "Make sure you get properly settled before I decide what comes next." Lily's smile was like sunrise after the longest, darkest night of winter. "I'd like that very much." "We both would." Thomas stirred in her arms and opened his eyes, looking around at the crowd and the smoldering ruins with the confused expression of someone waking from a terrible dream. "Mama," he said softly, his voice carrying the sweet clarity of childhood. "Is the bad man really gone now?" "Yes, sweetheart. The bad man is gone forever, and he can never hurt us again." The boy's gaze found Caleb, and his small face broke into a smile that could have melted stone. "Mr. Caleb saved us, didn't he? Just like the heroes in Papa's stories." "He certainly did. Does that mean he's going to stay with us now? Like a real Papa would?" The innocent question hung in the night air like a prayer, hopeful and trusting, and completely devastating in its simplicity. Caleb felt his throat tighten as he met those bright, expectant eyes, so much like Emma's, had been so full of faith in the basic goodness of the world. "For now," he managed to say, his voice rough with emotion he'd kept buried for years. "For as long as you both need me." 3 days later, Caleb rode alone to a wind-swept ridge overlooking the Badlands. He'd been to this place once before, years ago, when he was scouting new routes through the territory, but he'd never stopped. Never had reason to. Now he dismounted and walked slowly to a simple wooden cross that marked a grave on the highest point of the ridge. The marker was weathered and plain, with only 2 names carved deep into its surface: Sarah Branson, beloved wife, and Emma Branson, beloved daughter. Below that, in smaller letters worn smooth by wind and time, were the words, "Taken too soon." Caleb knelt beside the grave, removing his hat, as he'd done at countless other crosses in countless other places. But this time felt different. This time he wasn't just paying his respects to the dead, he was saying goodbye to the man he'd been, and hello to whoever he might become. "I found them, Sarah," he said quietly, his words carried away by the constant desert wind. "Found a woman and a boy who needed help just like you always said I would someday. I know it doesn't bring you and Emma back, and I know it doesn't make up for not being there when the fire came. But maybe it means I can stop running from what happened and start moving toward what might be." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wildflower he'd picked near the stream where they'd camped the previous night. It was simple and blue, the same color as the ones Emma used to braid into her hair during their Sunday walks around the homestead. "I'm going to look after them for a while." He continued placing the flower carefully on the weathered wood of the cross. "See them safe to Oregon, help them get established. And then, well, I reckon I'll figure out what comes next when the time arrives." The wind picked up, rustling through the sparse grass and sage, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and new possibilities. For a moment, Caleb could almost hear Sarah's voice in that wind, telling him what she'd always told him during their years together, that love wasn't something you lost when people died, but something you carried forward to share with others who needed it. Standing slowly, he replaced his hat and walked back to where his horse waited patiently. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from Butcher's Ben's chimneys. And beyond that, the road that would take them all toward Oregon and whatever future awaited there. When he returned to town, he found Lily waiting beside their newly repaired wagon, and Thomas playing in the dust at her feet with a carved wooden horse one of the grateful townspeople had made for him. She looked up as Caleb approached, and something in her expression told him she understood exactly where he'd been and why. "Ready to go?" she asked simply. "Ready as I'll ever be." As he climbed onto the wagon seat beside her, Thomas scrambled up to perch between them, chattering excitedly about the adventure that lay ahead. The boy had recovered completely from his ordeal, his natural resilience allowing him to bounce back with a remarkable speed that only children seem to possess. "Mr. Caleb," Thomas said as they rolled out of town past the rebuilt livery stable, "when we get to Oregon, are we going to have a real house with a big porch where I can sit and watch for storms?" "I expect we can manage something like that," Caleb replied, surprised by how naturally the word "we" had come to his lips. Lily reached into her traveling bag and pulled out a small square of cloth, a handkerchief she'd embroidered with wildflowers during the long, hopeful journey from Missouri that seemed like a lifetime ago. She pressed it into Caleb's calloused hand, her fingers lingering on his for just a moment. "Something to remember us by," she said softly, "when you decide it's time to move on to whatever's waiting for you out there." Caleb looked down at the delicate needlework, recognizing the same blue wildflowers he'd just left on Sarah's grave. But instead of the familiar stab of pain, the sight filled him with something he'd almost forgotten how to feel hope for tomorrow. "I might just keep this close for a long while," he said, tucking the handkerchief carefully into his shirt pocket over his heart. "Never know when a man might need reminding of all the good things life has to offer." As their wagon rolled west toward the mountains and the setting sun, Thomas fell asleep against Caleb's shoulder, and Lily began humming a soft lullaby that mixed with the creaking of wheels and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on packed earth. Behind them, the Badlands stretched away into purple shadows, holding their secrets and sorrows, like the desert held rain precious, because it was rare life-giving, because it fell on ground prepared to receive it. Caleb Branson had spent 5 years running from his past, carrying grief like a stone in his chest and avoiding any connection that might lead to fresh pain. But as he looked ahead toward the road to Oregon and the promise of new beginnings, he realized he wasn't running anymore. He was moving forward, carrying the memory of love lost, but also embracing the possibility of love found again in the most unexpected places. The Wasteland had taken much from all of them, husband and father, peace and innocence. The comfortable certainty that the world was a safe place for good people. But it had also given them something precious in return, a second chance at the kind of family that made all the hardships and dangers worthwhile. In the distance, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Caleb found himself looking forward to seeing what tomorrow might bring.